The yacht was named Oneida, 280 feet of polished teak and imported crystal. She cost over $3 million to build in 1892, the equivalent of $90 million today. 43 crew. No passenger manifest. No requirement to report what happened aboard once she left harbor. On November 15, 1924, she carried Hollywood's most powerful figures to sea. William Randolph Hearst, who owned the newspapers. Charlie Chaplin, the world's highest-paid star. Marion Davies, Hearst's companion. And Thomas Ince, a producer who needed Hearst's favor to survive. The trip was a birthday party. 3 days offshore. Private, elegant, safe. A gunshot was heard in the night. Ince was found injured in his cabin. No distress call was made. The yacht delayed its return by 12 hours. Ince died 2 days later. No autopsy was performed. The rumors began immediately. Hearst had caught Chaplin with Marion Davies. A gun was drawn. The wrong man was shot. Was this a crime of passion, or a conspiracy designed to hide one? An invitation to board Oneida was not delivered by telegram. It was extended in person, or over the telephone, by someone who already knew you. There were no written confirmations, no reply cards. You were simply told when and where to arrive. This was standard practice for private yachts in the 1920s. The absence of formality was itself a mark of exclusivity. If you needed instructions, you didn't belong. But informality has other effects. When no manifest exists, there is no official record of who was aboard. When no tickets are issued, there is no audit trail. When departure is recorded only in the harbor log as private charter, the names of passengers are not subject to review. This is not conspiracy. This is design. The guest list for the November voyage was small, somewhere between 10 and 15 people, depending on which account you trust. The exact number has never been confirmed. What we know is this. The host was William Randolph Hearst, publisher of newspapers in New York, Chicago, San Francisco, Los Angeles, and a dozen other cities. His syndicate reached 20 million readers daily. He owned film studios. He owned politicians. He owned the yacht. Among the guests, Charlie Chaplin, then the highest-paid entertainer in the world. Marion Davies, a film actress and Hearst's companion. Luella Parsons, a Hollywood gossip columnist employed by Hearst's papers. Dr. Daniel Carson Goodman, a physician and screenwriter. And Thomas Ince. Ince was a director and producer who had, a decade earlier, helped invent the studio system itself. He built Inceville, a sprawling production facility in the Santa Monica Hills, complete with western towns, Native American villages, and a standing army of extras. He produced hundreds of films. He understood assembly line storytelling before Ford understood assembly line cars. But by 1924, his power was fading. Inceville had been sold. His new studio, Triangle, had collapsed. He was negotiating to merge his remaining operations with Hearst's Cosmopolitan Pictures. He needed this trip. That dependency is worth pausing on, because dependency creates risk. When you board a yacht as a guest, you are not a customer. You have no contract, no receipt, no terms of service. You are present at the discretion of the host, and the host controls not only the itinerary, but the narrative of what happens aboard. If something goes wrong, you cannot leave. You cannot call for help independently. You cannot summon witnesses. You are offshore, which means you are outside the ordinary reach of law, outside the view of the press, outside the grid of documentation that makes events legible to investigators. You are, in effect, in a floating room with a locked door. And the person with the key also owns the newspapers that will describe what happened when the door opens again. William Randolph Hearst was 51 years old in 1924. He controlled the largest media empire in the United States. His newspapers did not simply report events, they shaped them. During the Spanish-American War, Hearst's papers had been accused of manufacturing public enthusiasm for intervention. The accusation stuck because it was true. He understood that narrative is a form of power, and he understood that power is most effective when it is invisible. Oneida was not Hearst's only yacht, but it was his favorite. He had acquired it in 1915 after its previous owner, a railroad magnate, died interstate. Hearst refitted the vessel extensively. New engines, new furnishings, a reinforced hull for longer voyages. The yacht was registered under a shell corporation, which meant ownership was difficult to trace in public records. This was legal. It was also strategic. When Hearst entertained aboard Oneida, he did so without fanfare. No photographers. No press releases. The guest lists were never published. What happened at sea stayed at sea, not because guests were sworn to secrecy, but because secrecy was the default. This is the first systemic feature worth noting. The absence of documentation is not an accident. It is a privilege. If you are wealthy enough, you can move through the world without leaving a paper trail. You can host events that are never announced. You can travel without manifests. You can resolve disputes without lawyers. And if something goes wrong, you can control the story before anyone else knows there is a story to tell. There were rumors before the yacht ever left port. This is important because it establishes context. The trip was not free of tension. There were emotional entanglements, alleged romantic jealousies, whispers about Marion Davies and Charlie Chaplin, speculation about Hearst's awareness of those whispers. None of this is verifiable, but the rumors were present, and rumors create pressure. At sea, there is no neutral space. There is no HR department, no mediator, no protocol for resolving interpersonal conflict. If two guests are in a dispute, they must either resolve it themselves or allow the host to resolve it for them. And if the host is himself implicated in the dispute, then there is no neutral party at all. This is the second systemic feature. Emotional volatility has no reporting channel. On land, tensions can be diffused by distance. You can leave a party. You can avoid someone. You can call a friend. At sea, you are contained. Every meal is shared. Every corridor is the same corridor. Every face is the same face, day after day. The architecture of a yacht enforces proximity, and proximity, under pressure, can become danger. The crew of Oneida numbered 43. This included deckhands, engineers, stewards, cooks, and a captain. Their quarters were separate from the guest cabins, located below deck near the engines. Crew contracts in the 1920s prioritized discretion. This was standard across all private yachts. Staff were expected to serve without intrusion, to be present when needed and invisible when not. But discretion has a corollary: silence. Crew members were not protected by the same legal frameworks that governed passengers. They could be dismissed without cause. They had no union, no grievance process. If they witnessed something troubling, their options were limited. They could report it to the captain, but the captain reported to the owner. They could report it to authorities after docking, but doing so would likely end their employment, and employment in private service was difficult to secure. So the incentive structure was clear. See nothing, say nothing, keep your position. This is the third systemic feature. Witnesses are disposable. When the only people who can testify to an event are also the people whose livelihoods depend on silence, testimony becomes unreliable. Not because the witnesses are dishonest, but because honesty is punished. Oneida departed San Pedro Harbor at approximately 10:00 a.m. on November 15th. The weather was clear. The Pacific was calm. The yacht moved south along the coast, passing Long Beach, then Laguna, then San Clemente. The plan, as understood by the guests, was to cruise leisurely for 3 days, returning to port on the evening of November 17th. There were no scheduled stops, no ports of call, just open water and time. This is the fourth systemic feature. Jurisdiction becomes ambiguous offshore. At sea, legal authority is fractured. Coastal waters fall under state jurisdiction, typically extending 3 nautical miles from shore. Beyond that, federal maritime law applies. But enforcement is sparse. The Coast Guard patrols, but not continuously. And private yachts are not required to report their positions unless they are in distress. This means that for long stretches of a voyage, a yacht is effectively sovereign. The captain is the law. The owner is the government. And whatever happens aboard is subject only to the discretion of those two parties. There is no automatic obligation to notify law enforcement of an incident. If someone is injured, or becomes ill, or dies, the decision to involve authorities rests with the captain and the owner. And if the owner prefers to handle the matter privately, there is no mechanism to compel disclosure. This is not a loophole. This is how the system was designed. By the evening of November 15th, the yacht was far enough from shore that the lights of the coast were no longer visible. The guests gathered in the main saloon for dinner. The table was set with crystal and silver. The menu included oysters, roast duck, and champagne. Crew moved silently between courses. Conversations were animated. Laughter carried through the wood-paneled corridors. To an observer, it would have appeared as a perfect evening. But perfection at sea is always provisional, because the sea is not land, and a yacht is not a house. A house has neighbors. A house has windows that face the street. A house can be entered by police without a warrant if there is probable cause. A yacht has none of these things. A yacht is a structure designed to separate its occupants from oversight. It floats, it moves, it carries no fixed address. Its interior is invisible to external observers. And this invisibility is not incidental, it is the entire point. When the wealthy retreat to their yachts, they are not seeking adventure. They are seeking enclosure, a place where the ordinary rules do not apply, where privacy is absolute, where accountability dissolves into salt water. Oneida was one such place. And on the night of November 15th, 1924, somewhere between the California coast and the open Pacific, that enclosure became something else. It became a crime scene. Or it became the perfect environment for a crime scene to be erased. The difference depends on what you believe about systems, and whether you think they are designed to reveal truth or to protect power. By morning, the yacht was still moving. The engines hummed. The crew changed shifts. Breakfast was served on the aft deck, but something had changed. Thomas Ince was no longer visible among the guests. The architecture of a yacht is not neutral. Every corridor, every door, every sightline is a choice. And those choices determine what can be seen, and by whom, and when. Oneida was designed with privacy as its organizing principle. The guest staterooms were located on the upper deck, each with its own door that locked from the inside. The crew quarters were 2 levels below, accessible only by a narrow service stairway. This vertical separation meant that crew and guests rarely occupied the same spaces simultaneously. Guests moved through wide, carpeted hallways. Crew moved through tight, uncarpeted passages designed for efficiency, not comfort. The main saloon had windows on 3 sides, but those windows faced outward, toward the ocean. They did not face the guest cabins. The promenade deck wrapped around the exterior of the vessel, but it was rarely used at night. What this means is that for most of the voyage, most of the yacht was unobserved. There was no continuous surveillance, no cameras, no guards stationed in hallways. The assumption was that guests policed themselves, and that crew respected boundaries. But assumptions are not systems, and in the absence of a system, visibility becomes a privilege. If you were a guest in a stateroom, you could lock your door and remain invisible for hours. If you were in a private salon, you could close the curtains and conduct a conversation that no one else would hear. And if something happened in one of those spaces, an argument, an injury, an act of violence, there would be no automatic record. No one would be required to respond. No one would be required to report. The event would exist only in the memory of whoever was present. And memory at sea is negotiable. The crew operated on a watch system. This is standard maritime practice. The day was divided into shifts: morning watch, afternoon watch, night watch. Each shift had a designated officer and a skeleton crew responsible for navigation, engine maintenance, and guest services. During the day, the full crew was active. Stewards moved between cabins, tidying rooms and preparing meals. Engineers monitored the engines. Deckhands maintained the exterior. But at night, staffing was reduced. Between midnight and 6 a.m., only essential personnel remained on duty: the night steward, the night engineer, the helmsman. Perhaps 6 or 7 people, total, for a vessel carrying 43 crew and more than a dozen guests. This created gaps, long stretches of time when entire sections of the yacht were unmonitored, hours when someone could move through the corridors without encountering another person, moments when an event could occur and remain unwitnessed simply because no one was assigned to be present. This is not negligence. This is efficiency. A private yacht is not a hospital. It is not a prison. There is no expectation of constant supervision. Guests are assumed to be autonomous. Crew are assumed to be trustworthy. But autonomy and trust are only useful when nothing goes wrong. When something does go wrong, the gaps become structural. The absence of witnesses becomes indistinguishable from the destruction of evidence. And if the people who know what happened have an incentive to say nothing, then the gaps become permanent. Alcohol was abundant aboard Oneida. This was not unusual. Private yachts in the 1920s were often floating speakeasies, stocked with liquor that was illegal on land but untouchable at sea. Prohibition did not apply in international waters, and even in coastal waters, enforcement was inconsistent. Hearst's yacht carried champagne, whiskey, gin, wine. The bar in the main saloon was stocked with crystal decanters. Cocktails were served before dinner. Wine was served with dinner. Brandy was served after. There was no limit. No one monitored consumption. Guests drank as much or as little as they wished. This too is worth pausing on. Alcohol impairs judgment. It lowers inhibitions. It makes people careless. And in an environment where danger is present, where firearms are accessible, where conflicts are unresolved, where the boundaries of acceptable behavior are unclear, impairment becomes risk. But there was no protocol for managing that risk. No one was required to remain sober. No one was assigned to monitor the guests for signs of intoxication. If someone drank too much, they were simply allowed to continue drinking. And if that person became volatile, or reckless, or violent, there was no system in place to intervene before harm occurred. This is the logic of private space. In public, there are bartenders who cut you off, bouncers who remove you, police who arrest you. But in private, there is only the discretion of the host. And if the host is also drinking, then there is no discretion at all. There was a gun aboard Oneida. This fact is not disputed. Multiple accounts confirm it. What remains unclear is who brought it, who had access to it, and where it was stored. In the 1920s, firearms were common on private yachts. They were used for sport, shooting at seabirds, or at targets thrown from the deck. They were also carried for protection, though protection from what exactly was rarely specified. But the presence of a weapon introduces a variable that cannot be controlled. A gun is not inherently dangerous, but in the wrong hands, or at the wrong moment, or in the presence of alcohol and unresolved tension, it becomes something else. It becomes the instrument by which an argument becomes a tragedy. And aboard a yacht, there is no standardized protocol for securing firearms. On land, gun safes exist, locks exist, regulations exist, but at sea, aboard a private vessel, the rules are determined by the owner. If the owner decides that a gun should be left on a table, or in a drawer, or in someone's cabin, that is the owner's prerogative. There is no inspection, no audit, no requirement to demonstrate that the weapon is stored responsibly. And so the question becomes, who last handled it? This is a question that was never satisfactorily answered. The guest cabins aboard Oneida were, in effect, sovereign states. Each had a door that locked. Each had curtains that could be drawn. Each was furnished with a bed, a desk, a wardrobe, a private washroom. Once a guest entered their cabin and closed the door, they were beyond the reach of observation. The crew would not enter unless summoned. Other guests would not intrude unless invited. This privacy was considered a feature, not a flaw. It was what made the yacht desirable. It allowed guests to retreat from the social demands of the voyage, to sleep, to read, to be alone. But privacy in a closed system is also opacity. If something happened inside a cabin, a conversation, a confrontation, a crime, there would be no neutral witness, no recording, no evidence beyond the testimony of whoever was inside. And if the people inside chose not to speak or chose to lie, there would be no way to contradict them. This is not a hypothetical. This is how the system functions. On land, if someone is injured in a private residence, neighbors might hear. Police might be called. Forensic investigators might examine the scene. But at sea, there are no neighbors, and the decision to involve authorities rests entirely with the people aboard. If those people decide that what happened is private, then it remains private. And privacy, in this context, is indistinguishable from concealment. By the second day of the voyage, a pattern had emerged. The guests maintained a routine: breakfast at 9, a walk on the promenade deck, lunch at noon, afternoon leisure, reading, conversation, cards, cocktails at 6, dinner at 7, socializing in the saloon until late. The crew maintained a parallel routine. They served, they cleaned, they remained unobtrusive. But beneath the routine, there was a directive. Maintaining calm was the priority, ensuring that guests were comfortable, ensuring that no disruption interfered with the voyage. This is the unspoken rule of private service. Problems are solved internally. If a guest becomes ill, you treat them on board. If a guest becomes intoxicated, you guide them to their cabin. If a guest becomes disruptive, you calm them quietly, without drawing attention. You do not escalate. You do not involve outsiders. You do not allow anything to become a spectacle. This directive is rarely articulated, but it is always understood, because the purpose of a private yacht is to provide an experience that is seamless, frictionless, free from the intrusions of the ordinary world. And maintaining that experience requires that certain things remain invisible. If a guest is injured, you do not announce it. If a conflict arises, you do not document it. If something goes wrong, you manage it in such a way that the other guests are never aware that anything went wrong at all. This is not conspiracy. This is hospitality. But hospitality, when applied to violence, becomes complicity. The yacht had a small medical kit, bandages, antiseptic, aspirin, a thermometer, basic supplies for treating minor injuries, cuts, burns, seasickness. But there was no doctor aboard. Dr. Goodman, one of the guests, was a physician, but he was not on duty. He had no equipment beyond what was in the kit. No surgical instruments, no anesthesia, no means of performing any procedure more complex than dressing a wound. This was typical for private yachts of the era. Medical emergencies were rare, and when they occurred, the standard response was to return to port as quickly as possible and transfer the patient to a hospital. But returning to port takes time, and time, in a medical emergency, is the variable that determines survival. If someone is seriously injured at sea, bleeding, unconscious, in shock, the delay between injury and treatment can be fatal. Not because the crew is incompetent, but because the yacht is not designed for trauma care. And if the decision-makers aboard are reluctant to acknowledge the severity of the injury, that delay becomes even longer. Because acknowledging severity means acknowledging that something has gone wrong. And acknowledging that something has gone wrong means involving authorities. And involving authorities means losing control of the narrative. So the incentive is to minimize, to describe the injury as less serious than it is, to reassure the other guests that everything is under control. And by the time it becomes clear that everything is not under control, it is often too late. There is a term used in maritime law, master of the vessel. The captain of a ship or yacht has absolute authority over everything that happens aboard. This authority is not ceremonial, it is legal. The captain can detain passengers, confiscate property, make decisions about medical treatment, decide whether to contact authorities. But aboard Oneida, the captain was not the master. William Randolph Hearst was. The captain commanded the crew, but Hearst commanded the voyage. Hearst decided when the yacht departed, where it sailed, when it returned. And Hearst decided what information left the yacht and what information stayed aboard. This creates a structural problem. If an incident occurs and the owner prefers to handle it privately, the captain has limited authority to override that preference. The captain works for the owner. The captain's employment depends on the owner's satisfaction. So if the owner says, "We will manage this internally," the captain's options are to comply or to resign. And resignation does not stop the suppression of information. It simply removes the one person who might have insisted on transparency. This is the deeper architecture of the system. It is not that individuals are corrupt. It is that the structure itself incentivizes concealment. Power protects power. And the mechanisms by which that protection occurs are not dramatic. They are bureaucratic, quiet, invisible. A decision not to call for help. A delay in returning to port. A log entry that omits a critical detail. These are not crimes. They are discretions. But the accumulation of discretions can produce the same result as a crime. It can allow a death to occur without consequence. It can allow an explanation to be accepted without investigation. And the people who benefit from that outcome are the same people who have the authority to determine what the outcome will be. On the second night, the guests dined again in the main saloon. The conversation was subdued. The champagne flowed, but the laughter was less frequent. Thomas Ince was not present. This absence was noted, but not discussed. Not openly. Guests whispered to one another. Speculation circulated. But no one asked the question directly. Where is he? Because asking directly would require an answer. And an answer would require an explanation. And an explanation would disrupt the carefully maintained atmosphere of the voyage. So the absence was noted, and then absorbed. The dinner continued. The crew cleared the plates. The evening ended. And the next morning, the yacht was still at sea. Still moving. Still beyond the reach of investigation. Still operating under the logic of privacy and discretion, and the assumption that whatever was happening aboard was being handled appropriately by the people who had the authority to handle it. But authority is not the same as accountability, and handling something appropriately is not the same as handling it honestly. The engines of Oneida burned coal. The coal was stored in bunkers below deck, near the boiler room. Every few hours, crew members shoveled coal from the bunkers into the furnaces. The furnaces heated water, which produced steam, which drove the engines. This process was continuous. The engines could not be turned off without allowing the steam pressure to drop, which would bring the yacht to a stop. So the engines ran, day and night, producing that low, constant hum that passengers could feel through the walls of their cabins. That hum was a kind of soundtrack. It marked time. It reminded you that the yacht was moving, that you were in transit, that you were not in a fixed place, but in a liminal space between departure and arrival. And in that liminal space, the ordinary rules felt suspended, not formally, not explicitly, but in the way that things feel when you are removed from the ordinary contexts that shape behavior, when there are no clocks to watch, no appointments to keep, no obligations beyond the ones imposed by the schedule of the yacht itself. This suspension can be pleasant. It can feel like freedom, but it can also feel like erasure, because when you are at sea, you are nowhere. You are in international waters, or coastal waters, or territorial waters, but you are not in a town, or a city, or a jurisdiction that has a name. You are in a space that exists only in relation to the vessel you are on. And the vessel is a closed system. And closed systems, as any engineer will tell you, do not exchange information with the outside world. They process inputs. They produce outputs. But what happens inside remains inside, unless someone decides to open the door. And aboard Oneida, in the early hours of November 16, 1924, that door remained closed. The sound came in the middle of the night. A sharp crack, loud enough to carry through walls, loud enough to wake someone sleeping 2 cabins away, but not loud enough, it seems, to wake everyone. This is the problem with reconstructing events from testimony given years later by people who have every reason to be imprecise. Some guests claimed they heard nothing. Others claimed they heard something, but weren't sure what. One account describes the sound as a gunshot. Another describes it as a door slamming. What is consistent across the accounts is this: something happened. And whatever it was, it did not trigger an immediate, coordinated response. There was no alarm, no emergency protocol, no announcement over the ship's intercom, because there was no intercom. Instead, there was silence. Or rather, there was the continuation of the ordinary sounds of the yacht, the hum of the engines, the creak of wood, the movement of water against the hull, and in that silence, decisions were made, not collectively, not transparently, but by whoever was present, and whoever had authority, and whoever understood that the shape of the next few hours would determine the shape of everything that followed. Thomas Ince was found in his cabin. The details here are sparse and contradictory. Some accounts say he was lying on the floor. Others say he was in bed. Some say he was conscious. Others say he was not. What is agreed upon is that he was injured, and that the injury was serious enough to require attention. But here is where the system begins to show its logic, because the first decision made was not to summon help from outside the yacht. It was to treat Ince on board, using the limited medical supplies available and the limited medical expertise of Dr. Goodman, who was a guest, not a practicing emergency physician. This decision is worth examining. If someone is shot, and the most persistent accounts suggest that Ince was in fact shot, the standard response is immediate evacuation to a hospital. Gunshot wounds are trauma. They involve bleeding, potential organ damage, shock. They require imaging, surgery, blood transfusion, none of which can be performed on a yacht. But Oneida did not turn around. It did not radio for a Coast Guard escort. It did not request permission to dock early at the nearest port. Instead, it continued on its scheduled route, and Ince was treated in his cabin, with bandages and aspirin and whatever else was in the medical kit. Why? The charitable explanation is that the severity of the injury was not immediately apparent, that it was assessed as non-life-threatening, that the decision to continue was made in good faith based on the information available at the time. The less charitable explanation is that turning around would have required an explanation, and an explanation would have required acknowledging that something had gone catastrophically wrong. And acknowledging that would have meant involving authorities. And involving authorities would have meant an investigation. And an investigation would have been inconvenient. The first story was that Thomas Ince had taken ill. This version circulated among the guests almost immediately. Indigestion, food poisoning, perhaps a heart problem. Something sudden, but not violent. Something unfortunate, but not criminal. This is the language of containment. When something happens aboard a private yacht, the first imperative is to prevent panic. To reassure the other guests that the situation is under control, that there is no danger, that the voyage will continue as planned. And the way you do that is by offering an explanation that is plausible and non-alarming and requires no further action from anyone. Illness fits that criteria. Illness is ordinary. People get sick. It happens. And if someone is ill, the appropriate response is to let them rest and to provide whatever comfort is available and to continue with the scheduled activities. But notice what this explanation omits. It omits the gunshot. It omits any mention of a weapon. It omits any suggestion that another person might have been involved. It transforms an event, a loud, violent, witnessed event, into a condition, a private medical matter, something that does not require documentation, or investigation, or outside intervention. And once that transformation is accepted, it becomes very difficult to reverse. Because if you later admit that the initial explanation was false, you must also admit that the initial explanation was a lie. And if you admit that it was a lie, you must explain why you lied. And explaining why you lied requires admitting that you had something to conceal. So, the incentive is to maintain the first story, even if it is incomplete, even if it is false, because changing the story is more dangerous than repeating it. Oneida did not return to port on the evening of November 17th as scheduled. It returned in the early morning hours of November 18th, approximately 12 hours late. This delay is unexplained in the official accounts. No mechanical failure was reported. No weather issue. No change to the itinerary was announced in advance. The yacht simply arrived later than expected. And in those 12 hours, something changed. We don't know what. We can only observe the gap, the space between the scheduled return and the actual return, the hours during which the yacht was offshore, beyond observation, beyond communication, and whatever was happening aboard was happening without any external record. This is the utility of the sea. Time offshore is fungible. It can be used for anything. Rest, conversation, cleanup, rehearsal of a story, disposal of evidence. And because there is no external observer, there is no way to verify how that time was actually spent. The yacht's log would, in theory, contain a record. But ship logs are written by subordinates. They record what they are told to record. And what they are told to record is determined by the captain, who is employed by the owner. So the log is not a neutral document. It is a managed document. And if the owner prefers that certain details be omitted, those details will be omitted. Not falsified, just absent. And absence is not a crime. When Oneida docked at San Pedro, Thomas Ince was removed from the yacht on a stretcher. He was not taken to a hospital immediately. He was taken to a hotel. This fact appears in multiple accounts, though the reason for it is never clarified. Why would an injured man who had been untreated aboard a yacht for more than 48 hours be taken to a hotel rather than directly to a medical facility? One possibility is that his condition had stabilized and he was thought to be recovering. Another possibility is that transporting him to a hotel allowed for a delay, time to arrange a private physician, time to control the flow of information, time to ensure that his arrival at a hospital, if it became necessary, would not trigger immediate questions from staff or authorities. Because hospitals have protocols, they are required to report certain injuries. Gunshot wounds, for instance, must be reported to police. This is not optional. It is mandated by law. But if a patient arrives at a hospital hours or days after the injury occurred, and if the injury has already been described as something else, a fall, a heart attack, a sudden illness, then the hospital has no reason to suspect that the initial explanation is false. And without suspicion, there is no investigation. So the sequence matters, the timing matters, the narrative matters. If Ince had been taken directly from the yacht to a hospital with an open wound, with witnesses describing a gunshot, the hospital would have been required to report it. But if he was taken to a hotel first and treated there by a private physician, and only later admitted to a hospital after his condition had deteriorated, then the chain of documentation is broken. And once the chain is broken, it is very difficult to reconstruct. Thomas Ince died on November 19, 1924. 2 days after the yacht returned to port, the official cause of death was heart failure. This determination was made without a formal autopsy. An autopsy was discussed, it was considered, and then it was declined. This is legal. Autopsies are not always mandatory. In cases where the cause of death is believed to be natural, and where the family does not request further examination, the body can be released without one. But the absence of an autopsy is also convenient. Because an autopsy would have revealed the presence of a bullet, if there was one. It would have documented the trajectory of the wound. It would have provided forensic evidence that could be compared against statements, against timelines, against the accounts of witnesses. And forensic evidence is difficult to dispute, so the decision not to perform an autopsy meant that the only evidence of what happened aboard Oneida was the testimony of the people who were aboard. And testimony, as we have seen, is malleable. People forget. People misremember. People lie. But bullets do not lie. Wounds do not lie. Tissue damage does not lie. And if you want to ensure that a particular version of events is accepted, the easiest way to do so is to make sure that no physical evidence exists that could contradict that version. This is not murder. This is risk management. The ship's log for the voyage of November 15th to 18th, 1924, was completed by the first officer, under the supervision of the captain. It is a sparse document. It records the departure time, the arrival time, the weather conditions, the course headings. It lists the names of the crew on duty during each watch. But it does not list the names of the guests. It does not describe any incidents. It does not mention Thomas Ince. This is not unusual. Ship logs are navigational records, not social diaries. They are meant to document the operation of the vessel, not the activities of the passengers. But the absence is still notable. Because a ship's log is, in theory, the definitive record of what happened aboard. It is a legal document. In the event of an accident, or a dispute, or an investigation, the log is the first thing authorities will examine. And if the log contains no mention of an incident, then from a legal standpoint, the incident did not occur. This is the power of omission. You do not need to lie. You simply need to decline to include certain information. And if the information is not included, it does not exist in the official record. And once enough time has passed, the official record becomes the only record that matters. There were rumors immediately after Ince's death. Rumors that he had been shot. Rumors that the shooting was accidental. Rumors that it was not accidental. Rumors that Hearst had fired the gun, intending to shoot Chaplin, but hitting Ince by mistake. Rumors that Marion Davies had been involved. Rumors that the entire incident had been hushed up. These rumors circulated in Hollywood, in newspaper offices, in private clubs. They were whispered about, but not printed. They were repeated, but not verified. And gradually they faded, not because they were disproven, but because there was no evidence to support them. And without evidence, a rumor is just a story, and stories over time lose their urgency. What remains is the official version. Ince died of heart failure. He had been ill aboard the yacht. He was taken to a hotel, then to a hospital, where he died. A tragedy, but not a crime. This version was printed in Hearst's newspapers. It was repeated in other newspapers. It became the accepted narrative. And once a narrative is accepted, it is very difficult to challenge. Because challenging it requires evidence. And the evidence, if it ever existed, was never preserved. The yacht's log was incomplete. No autopsy was performed. The crew was dispersed. The guests declined to speak publicly. And so the truth, whatever it was, remained aboard Oneida, locked in a cabin, buried in the gap between the scheduled return and the actual return, dissolved in 12 hours of offshore time that no one was required to account for. The yacht moved on. Oneida continued to operate. Hearst hosted other guests, other voyages, other parties. The vessel was sold in 1938. It changed hands several times. It was eventually scrapped in the 1950s, its wood and brass and steel cut apart and sold for salvage. But the system it represented did not end. Private yachts still operate under the same logic. Offshore, beyond observation, with minimal oversight. The The crew still signs contracts that prioritize discretion. The guests still move through spaces that are not monitored. The logs are still written by subordinates. And when something goes wrong, the same incentives apply. Minimize, contain, manage the narrative, protect the host, preserve the appearance of order. Because the purpose of a private yacht is not transparency, it is enclosure. And enclosure, by definition, hides what is inside. There is a question that has never been answered. What happened to the gun? If a weapon was discharged aboard Oneida, it should have been retained as evidence. It should have been examined, test-fired, compared against the wound, if a wound existed. But no gun was ever produced. No weapon was ever logged. No forensic analysis was ever conducted. This could mean that no gun was involved, that the entire story is a fabrication, that Thomas Ince simply died of natural causes, and the rumors were invented by people who wanted to believe something more dramatic had occurred. Or it could mean that the gun was disposed of, thrown overboard perhaps during those 12 hours at sea, cleaned and returned to storage with no record of its use. Or it could mean that the gun was never lost, that it remained aboard, that it was simply never mentioned, because mentioning it would have required an explanation, and an explanation would have required an investigation, and an investigation would have revealed that the system designed to protect the passengers had in fact protected only some of them: the wealthy, the powerful, the ones who controlled the narrative, while the others, the dependent, the vulnerable, the expendable, were left to absorb the cost. This is not speculation. This is how closed systems function. They protect those who operate them, and they erase those who do not. When Oneida docked in San Pedro on the morning of November 18, 1924, it entered a peculiar jurisdictional space. The voyage had begun in California waters. It had moved through state-controlled coastal zones, then into federal maritime territory, then back again. The injury, if there was an injury, had occurred at an unknown time, in an unknown location, in waters that might have been under state authority, or federal authority, or no clear authority at all. This fragmentation is not accidental, it is structural. Maritime law in the United States is a patchwork. State laws govern waters within 3 nautical miles of shore. Federal law governs beyond that. But enforcement is inconsistent. The Coast Guard has jurisdiction over safety and navigation. Local police have jurisdiction over crimes committed by state residents. Federal agents have jurisdiction over crimes that cross state lines or occur in international waters. And when an incident falls into the cracks between these jurisdictions, it becomes very easy for everyone to defer. The local police in San Pedro could argue that the death occurred at sea, beyond their jurisdiction. The Coast Guard could argue that no distress call was made, so no response was required. Federal authorities could argue that without a complaint, or a witness, or evidence of a federal crime, there was no basis for investigation, and so the case becomes no one's responsibility. This is not corruption. This is bureaucracy. Each agency has limited resources. Each agency prioritizes cases where jurisdiction is clear, where evidence is strong, where prosecution is likely. A death aboard a private yacht, with no witnesses willing to speak, with no physical evidence, with conflicting accounts and powerful individuals involved. This is not a case that any agency wants to pursue. So, it is not pursued. And Thomas Ince is buried quietly, and the incident is closed. Not solved. Not investigated. Just closed. The newspapers covered the death, but not uniformly. Hearst's own papers ran brief notices. Film producer Thomas Ince dies after illness aboard yacht. The stories were short, respectful. They mentioned his contributions to cinema. They noted that he had been a guest of William Randolph Hearst. They described his sudden illness and subsequent death. They did not mention a gunshot. They did not mention a weapon. They did not quote any crew members or guests. Other newspapers, not owned by Hearst, ran slightly different versions. Some hinted at rumors. Mystery surrounds death of Thomas Ince. Questions raised about yacht voyage. But even these stories were cautious. They cited unnamed sources. They used conditional language. Allegedly. Reportedly. It is said. Because journalism, in 1924, operated under constraints that are difficult to imagine today. Libel laws were strict. Accusations against wealthy individuals could result in lawsuits that would bankrupt a publication. And more importantly, access was controlled. If you wanted to interview powerful people, you needed their cooperation. If you antagonized them, you lost access. And without access, you had no story. So the press walked a line. They reported what was safe to report. They hinted at what was unsafe. And they waited to see if anyone with standing, a family member, a witness, an official, would come forward with something actionable. No one did. And so the story faded. Not because it was resolved, but because it became unprintable. There is a term for this: structural silence. The absence of coverage not because of censorship, but because the architecture of the media industry makes certain stories impossible to pursue. Hearst did not need to threaten anyone. He did not need to bribe anyone. He simply needed to own enough newspapers that the story could not gain traction elsewhere. And he did. The crew of Oneida was dismissed within days of the yacht's return. This was standard practice. Private yacht crews were hired on a per-voyage basis, or on short-term contracts. When the voyage ended, the contract ended. Crew members were paid, given references if they were in good standing, and sent on their way. But dismissal also accomplishes something else. It disperses witnesses. The crew of Oneida came from different places. Some were from California, some were from the East Coast, some were from Europe. When they left the yacht, they returned to those places. And once they were scattered, it became very difficult to locate them, to interview them, to gather their testimony in any coordinated way. This is not conspiracy. This is logistics. If an investigator wants to interview a crew member, they must first find that crew member. They must determine where the person went after leaving the yacht. They must contact them, persuade them to cooperate, arrange for testimony to be taken. And if the crew member has moved to another city, or another country, or has taken another job that requires discretion, the likelihood of cooperation drops significantly. Add to this the fact that crew members have limited legal protection. They can be dismissed without cause. They can be blacklisted within the industry. If they speak publicly about what they witnessed, they risk never working in private service again. So the incentive is silence. And silence, when distributed across geography and employment insecurity, becomes permanent. There is a financial dimension to this story that is rarely discussed. Thomas Ince's estate was settled quietly. His debts were paid. His assets were liquidated. His family received a settlement. The terms of that settlement were never made public. But settlements of this kind typically include non-disclosure agreements, provisions that prohibit the family from speaking publicly about the circumstances of death, provisions that allow the estate to be resolved without litigation, without publicity, without further investigation. This is standard estate law. It is not sinister. It is efficient. But efficiency, in this context, serves a particular purpose. It closes the case financially, which makes it easier to close the case legally and socially. Because once the family has been compensated, they have less incentive to pursue further answers. And if they are prohibited from speaking publicly, they cannot provide information to journalists or investigators who might want to reopen the case. This is how liability is managed. Not through denial, but through resolution. You settle the claim. You compensate the survivors. You include language that ensures the matter will not be revisited, and the cost of that settlement is vastly lower than the cost of a public trial, or a scandal, or an investigation that might implicate powerful individuals. So the settlement is reached. The estate is closed. The family moves on. And the questions remain unanswered, but no longer urgent, because the people who have standing to ask them have been paid not to. On December 21st, 1924, a little over a month after Thomas Ince's death, the San Diego District Attorney issued a statement. The statement said that the District Attorney's office had reviewed the circumstances of Ince's death and had determined that there was no evidence of foul play, that Ince had died of natural causes, that no further investigation was warranted. This statement is peculiar for several reasons. First, the San Diego District Attorney had no clear jurisdiction over a death that occurred either in Los Angeles County or at sea. Second, no formal investigation had been conducted, no autopsy, no witness interviews on the record, no forensic analysis. So the statement was not the conclusion of an investigation. It was the announcement that no investigation would occur. This is a common bureaucratic maneuver. When a case is politically sensitive, or when powerful individuals are involved, or when evidence is sparse and prosecution unlikely, the easiest resolution is a statement of no action. The statement does not exonerate anyone. It does not confirm any particular version of events. It simply declares that the matter is closed. And once it is closed, it is very difficult to reopen, because reopening a case requires new evidence. And new evidence is unlikely to emerge when the original scene was never secured, when no forensic work was performed, when witnesses have been dispersed, and when the people with the most knowledge have the most to lose by speaking. So the case remains closed. Not solved, not resolved, just closed. And closed, in the language of bureaucracy, means forgotten. Luella Parsons, the gossip columnist who had been aboard Oneida, became one of the most powerful figures in Hollywood within months of the voyage. Her column was syndicated in Hearst's newspapers. She had access to every studio, every star, every scandal. She could make or destroy careers with a single item. This ascent is sometimes described as a reward. The theory being that Parsons witnessed something aboard the yacht, and that her silence was purchased with influence. But the truth is, likely more mundane. Parsons was already a skilled columnist. She understood the industry. She had relationships with publicists, with agents, with studio heads. Her rise was not sudden. It was the continuation of a trajectory that had begun years earlier. But the timing is suggestive, because what Parsons gained from the voyage was not just silence, it was leverage. If she knew something, or if people believed she knew something, then she had power. Not the power to speak, but the power to refrain from speaking. And that power could be converted into access, into information, into the kind of insider status that made her column indispensable. This is how systems of complicity function. You do not need to be paid directly. You simply need to understand that your discretion is valuable. And that value can be extracted in 1,000 small ways. A returned phone call, an exclusive interview, a tip about a casting decision. And over time, those small extractions accumulate into a career. This is not evidence of a conspiracy. It is evidence of alignment, of incentives that point in the same direction, of a professional ecosystem where silence is currency and access is the return on investment. The question of truth, in cases like this, is often misunderstood. People assume that truth is binary. Either something happened or it did not. Either Ince was shot or he was not. Either Hearst fired the gun or he did not. But in a closed system, truth is not binary. It is probabilistic. We know that Thomas Ince boarded a yacht in good health. We know that he left the yacht injured or ill. We know that he died 2 days later. We know that no autopsy was performed. We know that the crew was dispersed. We know that the official story was illness. We know that rumors of a shooting circulated immediately. We know that those rumors were never confirmed or disproven. What we do not know is what happened in the hours between the sound of the gunshot, if there was a gunshot, and the moment Ince was removed from the yacht. We do not know who was present. We do not know what was said. We do not know what decisions were made, or by whom, or why. And because we do not know, we are left with inference. We can infer from the structure of the system that certain outcomes were more likely than others. That concealment was easier than disclosure. That silence was safer than testimony. That power protected itself. But inference is not proof, and without proof, the case remains open in the imagination, even if it is closed in the courts. This is the liminal space where the story lives. Not in certainty, but in doubt. Not in answers, but in questions that cannot be resolved. And that doubt is not a failure of investigation. It is the intended outcome of a system designed to prevent investigation. Oneida was sold in 1938, 14 years after the voyage. Hearst's finances had deteriorated during the Depression. He was forced to liquidate assets. The yacht was one of them. The new owner was a businessman from San Francisco. He used the vessel for corporate entertaining. Then he sold it to another owner. Then another. By the 1940s, Oneida was operating as a charter yacht. Anyone with sufficient money could rent her for a week, a month, a season. She carried tourists through the Caribbean. She hosted weddings and reunions. And with each change of ownership, the memory of what had happened aboard became less distinct. The crew who had been present in 1924 were gone, retired or dead or moved on to other ships. The guests who had been aboard were aging, and their recollections, if they ever spoke of the voyage at all, were filtered through decades of silence and self-interest. By the time the yacht was scrapped in the 1950s, the incident had become a footnote, a piece of Hollywood lore, a story that was retold in biographies and documentaries, but never with enough detail to be conclusive. And the yacht itself, the physical space where the event occurred, was dismantled. Its wood was burned. Its brass was melted. Its steel was repurposed. The crime scene, if there ever was a crime scene, was erased. Not by intention, just by time. And time is the most effective solvent. It dissolves memory. It disperses witnesses. It turns evidence into anecdote, and anecdote into myth. There is a philosophical question embedded in this story. If a system is designed to erase the evidence of a crime, and if that erasure is successful, can we still call it a crime? Or does the crime require a record, a trial, a verdict in order to exist in any meaningful sense? This is not an abstract question. It is a practical one, because the legal system operates on the principle that crimes must be proven, that accusations must be substantiated, that guilt must be established beyond a reasonable doubt. And if the conditions for proof cannot be met, if the evidence was never collected, if the witnesses never testified, if the case was never brought, then the crime, in a legal sense, does not exist. It becomes a rumor, a story, a possibility. And possibilities do not result in convictions. So the system achieves its goal, not by proving innocence, but by preventing the establishment of guilt. And the people who benefit from that system continue to benefit. They retain their wealth, their reputation, their power, while the people who were harmed, Thomas Ince, his family, anyone else aboard who witnessed something they were not supposed to witness, are absorbed into the silence. The final chapter of this story is not about Thomas Ince. It is about the yacht, because Oneida was not a passive container. It was an active participant. It created the conditions for the incident to occur. Its architecture, private cabins, unmonitored corridors, gaps in crew coverage, made violence possible. Its isolation made concealment easy. Its mobility made investigation difficult. And after the incident, it continued to operate. It absorbed the event. It carried it forward, and eventually it erased it, simply by continuing to exist, continuing to move, continuing to serve new guests who had no knowledge of what had happened before. This is the nature of systems. They outlast individuals. They persist through events that would destroy any single person. They adapt and endure and continue to function because their purpose is not to serve any particular individual, but to perpetuate themselves. A yacht is a machine for generating privacy, and privacy for the wealthy, is a resource more valuable than money. It allows them to live without scrutiny, to act without accountability, to make mistakes or commit crimes, and to walk away without consequence. Because the system that protects them is not a conspiracy. It is not a network of corrupt officials or bribed witnesses. It is simply the architecture of their world. The way that wealth converts into space, and space into opacity, and opacity into impunity. And that architecture does not require maintenance. It requires only that the people who benefit from it continue to use it. If you visit the archives in Los Angeles, you can find a few photographs of Oneida. Black and white images, slightly faded, showing the yacht at anchor in the harbor. The sleek lines of the hull. The tall masts. The polished brass fittings catching the light. In the photographs, the yacht looks elegant, timeless, a relic of an era when wealth was expressed through craftsmanship, through attention to detail, through objects that were built to last. But the photographs do not show the interior. They do not show the cabins, the corridors, the spaces where guests retreated, and where crew moved unseen, and where decisions were made that would determine whether an incident became a scandal or simply disappeared. Because those spaces were never meant to be photographed. They were meant to be private. And privacy, as we have seen, is not the same as innocence. It is simply the condition under which certain kinds of behavior become possible. The question that remains, after all of this, is not what happened to Thomas Ince. The question is whether the system that allowed his death to be erased is still functioning. And the answer is yes. Private yachts still operate under the same maritime laws. Crew members still sign the same non-disclosure agreements. Guests still move through spaces that are not monitored, not documented, not subject to external review. And when something goes wrong, the same mechanisms activate. Delay, minimization, private resolution, dispersal of witnesses, control of the narrative. The technology has changed. The yachts are larger, more luxurious, equipped with satellite communications and stabilizers and helipads. But the logic is the same. Offshore, beyond observation, the ordinary rules do not apply. And the people who benefit from that exception are the same people who have always benefited: the wealthy, the powerful. The ones who understand that privacy is not a right, but a privilege. And that privilege, properly deployed, can convert violence into paperwork, and paperwork into silence, and silence into history. There is no resolution to this story. No trial, no verdict, no confession. There is only the structure, the yacht, the voyage, the gap between departure and return, the hours that were never accounted for, the logs that were never complete, the witnesses who were never called, and the understanding, quiet and persistent, that the system worked exactly as it was designed to work. Not to reveal truth, but to protect power. Not to serve justice, but to serve the people who own the vessel, and the newspapers, and the courts, and the mechanism by which events are transformed into narratives, and narratives into official history. Thomas Ince died on November 19, 1924. The cause of death was listed as heart failure. The yacht sailed on. And the crime, if there was a crime, was not the killing. It was the system that made the killing invisible. The system that exists still, waiting, breathing, moving through dark water, carrying its secrets to the bottom, where light does not reach and questions dissolve into salt. And the only sound is the hum of engines, and the creak of wood, and the eternal patient silence of the sea.